Week 4 of The Night is Normal covers chapters 19 through 25, in which we examine 6 more tools for processing disillusionment with God based on lessons from the lives of Jesus, Elijah, the disciples, Job, a friend of mine named Josette, and William Carey. And I also finished the 2 stories that I began in chapter 11. So for this time together, to supplement the book and workbook, I'd like to offer some thoughts that are less about us being disillusioned with God and more about how we respond to others who are disillusioned with God. Because perhaps one of the questions I receive most often is, how do I help my fill in the blank, friend, spouse, sibling, child, coworker, leader, who's in the middle of a night? And sometimes, but not always, how can I help is actually code for how do I fix this? How do I turn on the light in their night? And of course, I do hope that the principles and tools in this book not only help you, but help you help others. However, since the night is normal, my focus, as you already know, is navigating the night well, as opposed to ending the night permanently. That's beyond my reach. As a mentor, there certainly are a set of skills that I call upon when walking with someone who's disillusioned with God. When we're together, I try to be fully present, to listen deeply, to encourage emotional honesty, to help discern, when possible, roots and sources of the pain, to exercise patience, to be faithful in prayer. But since that's easier for me to say, and perhaps harder for someone else to see, we're going to look at an ancient example in the scriptures of 3 souls whose initial intentions were to support a friend who was in a very, very dark night. A story that models choices we can make that help, as well as choices we can make that hurt. As you probably guessed, we're going to look at the example of Job's friends, which we'll consider again from another lens next week. Scholars' best guess is that Job lived during the patriarchal period, sometime during the lifetimes of Abraham, Isaac, or Jacob. And Talmudic tradition is that the book was written by Moses. We meet Job's 3 friends in chapter 2 after Job has lost his livestock, his servants, his children, and his health. So let's pick up in Job chapter 2, verse 11. When Job's 3 friends, Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamanite, heard about all the troubles that had come upon him, they set out from their homes and met together by agreement to go and sympathize with him and comfort him. Verse 12, when they saw him from a distance, they began to weep aloud. They tore their robes and sprinkled dust on their heads. Verse 13, they sat on the ground with him for 7 days and 7 nights. No one said a word to him because they saw how great his suffering was. These 3 friends modeled several things very well for us. First, they formed a group with the purpose of consoling Job. And we too can be proactive in gathering other sympathetic souls together to provide supportive coverage for a loved one in their night. Second, because they were able and willing, they journeyed to be physically present to Job. And though that's not always possible, or depending on the level of relationship, preferable, there's something about in person that can carry healing. Barry, in his loss, my husband, in his loss, said that it was helpful when people brought him a meal, but it was healing when they stayed to eat that meal with him. Third, when they saw Job, they validated his suffering by grieving with him and for him. When a loved one is suffering, they need to be seen. They need for their pain to be acknowledged as real. And fourth, they respected Job's night by offering their presence without platitudes, at least at first. In just a few verses, they're about to shift from being consolers to being fixers. However, in these verses, they modeled for us the power that silence possesses to communicate respect to those whom we love. in the night, people often need a human more than they need a homily. And then Job broke that silence with something the three did not expect. The reactions and interactions that followed are fascinating. But since a chapter by chapter consideration of the book of Job is well beyond the scope of this teaching, I'd like to draw our attention to a few ways in which Job's friends are also an example to us of how to hurt more than help. Starting in chapter 3, Job opens his mouth and curses the day he was born. Because if he had never been born, he would not now be longing for death. At this point, Job preferred never having ever existed to the torment of no longer possessing either peace or rest. And though the three were willing to sit with Job and his sores for 7 days, they couldn't sit with Job and his emotional honesty for more than a few seconds. And I think it would serve us well to ask, why? Only God knows that answer in full, and we're asking the question at several thousands of years' distance. But this interaction is not unfamiliar to us, is it? Have you ever told someone, man, I just feel blah, and had them instantly stop listening and start fixing, or even start rebuking? We can be kind of clumsy in the church with each other's less than lovely emotions, can't we? Job's raw emotions obviously triggered something in his friends because they shifted from consoling through their silent presence to correcting through their rather accusing voices in one verse. No doubt there's a multitude of reasons that can account for why Job's friends were so rattled by chapter 3 honesty. But as I read their responses, I can't help but wonder if perhaps one of the reasons was that their faith had no space for that level of emotional honesty. And if you've never given yourself permission to be that honest, it's close to impossible to give others permission to be that honest. And that is in part why I love Matthew 26 so much. In the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus describes his soul as sorrowful and troubled. He describes himself as overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. It's not a pretty picture, but it's an honest one. Jesus was sinless and sorrowful. Jesus was absolutely obedient and troubled, which, as I've written about elsewhere in 40 Days of Decrease, means that a troubled soul isn't always the sign of a faith deficit. In Matthew 26, and I venture in Job chapter 3, a troubled soul was a sign of obedience in the making. So perhaps another reason why we can react so impatiently to others' expressions of deep sorrow and disillusionment is because we have a tendency to mistake their emotions for their theology. And there was a psychologist whom I had the privilege of having a few sessions with during one of my cancer recurrences. And he said two things that have stayed with me over the years. His name was Dr. Fernando Escobar. What a great name. And he said, number one, think of emotions as energy in motion so that you can, number two, view them with compassionate curiosity. During that recurrence, my emotions were all over the map. I was so frustrated with myself that my emotions weren't lining up obediently behind what I knew to be true. But Dr. Escobar's wisdom gave me permission. It helped me to not over-spiritualize my feelings. I think we can agree a lot of things shape our feelings. How much vitamin D we've collected from sunshine lately, how much time we've spent on our devices that day, our hormone levels, the weather, the quality of our sleep, how much caffeine and sugar we've consumed. Emotions are just energy in motion. A lot of times our emotions are more chemical than spiritual. So it's okay to hold them honestly, to give them some breathing room, to circle around them with compassion and think, this is what I really feel. How curious. The ability to give our friends that same permission to be emotionally honest is a gift, because honesty builds safety, and safety creates trust, and trust grows love. So perhaps they had no grid for emotional honesty. Perhaps subsequently they over-spiritualized Job's emotions. And perhaps that's because of one underlying factor. Repeatedly throughout their discourses in the book of Job, each one in different ways expresses their belief that Job's misfortune was proof positive of Job's sin. And so Job's continued assertions that he was innocent both offended them and threatened them. How so? Well, if we can fully explain someone's pain by fully blaming their choices for their pain, we can continue in the illusion that such pain for us is avoidable. One by one, each one in turn, each friend told Job, "This is all your fault. There's some secret sin you've hidden, some lie you've told, some soul you've mistreated." Perhaps Bildad's words from Job 18 sum it up well. He said, "The lamp of the wicked is snuffed out. His own schemes throw him down. Terrors startle him on every side and dog his every step. It eats away at parts of his skin. The memory of him perishes from the earth. He has no name in the land. He is driven from light into darkness. Surely such is the dwelling of an evil man. Such is the place of one who knows not God." Job's friends believed that the night was a spiritual punishment and that the day was a spiritual reward. They believed that the sinless would always have sunlight, and that only the disobedient would dwell in darkness. And they desperately needed Job to cough up something, to confess something, to help keep their tidy equations intact. But there's a timeless problem with equations in the life of faith. It's simply impossible to reduce the spiritual to the mathematical. Equations gut faith of relationship, and if faith is anything, it's relational. And relationship is how the whole story of Job began. God, in chapter 1, verse 8, said of Job, "There is no one on earth like him. He is blameless and upright, a man who fears God and shuns evil." Job had a target on his back, not because of disobedience, but because of obedience. Not because of unrighteousness, but because of righteousness. And his three friends had no theology for that. But Job stood firm. He refused to lie about himself or his God, even to make others feel better. Multiple times he prayed, "God, show me if I've sinned. Reveal it to me and I'll repent, but I will not lie to make sense of it all. Let it remain senseless, because I will not sell my integrity to purchase some kind of pseudo peace." One of the greatest gifts we can give our friends going through the night is to not edit their honesty, to not dilute their reality, to know in faith that the losing of illusions and the gaining of reality is an invitation for them and for us to even greater love. That's what happens in the night. Our souls are seasoned by pain, and well seasoned, like Job on the other side of his night, we continue to serve as part of the broken body of Christ. not as those who have mistaken optimism for faith, but as wounded healers who understand what Jesus meant when he said, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." Until next week.